The Wild West. What do we think of? Gunfights, drunken shootouts in rowdy saloons, dashing cowboys and stoic sheriffs going up against hardened, gunslinging outlaws. Families trying to survive against the frontiers and frequent clashes with local indigenous populations. Jesse James, Billy the Kid, Wyatt Earp, Butch Cassidy, and the Sundance Kid. Not to mention gold, railways, and six-shooters. But was it really like this? What was life actually like on the American frontier? Hollywood and TV and books have given us a certain image of life in the so-called Wild West, but how true is it? In actuality, many of these elements were indeed true. Jesse James and the like really did exist. However, the reality of life in the Wild West wasn't that stereotypical image that so many of us have. Yes, it could often be dangerous, and many places were literally lawless. However, people also worked together, and they got on with things without necessarily having to resort to violence. So, what was real and what was a myth? Well, let's start by looking at when and where the Wild West actually took place. It can be argued that things really got moving with the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. France controlled Louisiana, and the big attraction for the United States was access to the Mississippi River and port to New Orleans. Under Napoleon, France was resurgent after the defeat of the 7 Years' War. This meant that French were heavily focused on the continued conflict with Britain. Thus, Louisiana and the subsequent access to the Mississippi River were sold to America for the bargain of a lifetime. The United States almost doubled in size with its new territory stretching from the Gulf of Mexico in the south up to Canada and from the Rockies in the west to the Mississippi in the east. The impetus was now on for Western advancement for American settlers as the push to the Pacific began. This was driven by a boom in population. Thanks to increased birth rates and constant immigration, the U.S. population rocketed from 5 million in 1803 to over 20 million in 1840. The westward expansion was based on the concept of manifest destiny. This was a philosophy that if America's destiny, as willed by God, was to settle and spread democracy across the North American landscape, then that's what they were going to do. It was a shared view by many, including influential politicians and business people and newspaper editors. It also implied that if this manifest destiny was meaning displacing indigenous people or declaring war on other nations standing in the way, and so be it. The US government was hell-bent on its expansion policy, and as a result, for example, any Native American tribes that resisted were forced onto reservations. The great push westward was not to be stopped, and the ideal of working on your land was a huge driving force. Immigrants from Europe were drawn to the idea of the freedom of working on their own land and becoming financially independent. And so, in the first half of the 19th century, settlers rushed towards the American frontiers. For the overwhelming majority of pioneers in the West, life was undoubtedly tough. First off, there was the rough terrain to cross in trying weather on horse-led carts and carriages. Not to mention many expeditions and attempts to settle on plots of lands were met with ferocious resistance by the long-established Native American tribes. Once the pioneers found land that they could settle on, and came the often overlooked issues of day-to-day survival. Houses had to be built, land had to be cleared, and crops needed to be planted. Livestock needed fertile land on which to graze, and barns had to be built for their safety. Wolves, wildcats, coyotes, natives, and cattle rustlers were all real threats to farmers. The Western pioneers also needed access to fresh water, and there was a constant worry of weather destroying any crops or harvest. It should be noted, of course, that most of these issues were not so unique to the American West, however. Any period in history where groups of people have expanded their frontiers has usually been faced with the same difficulties. For example, settlers in Australia also struggled against the climate, terrain, and indigenous opposition. Although life in general was indeed challenging, the notion that the West was a constant sea of violence is misleading. Because of the lack of established law enforcement on both local and federal levels, local communities would often band together to form their own law systems and ways of doing business. Resorting to violence was widely seen as a deterrent to progress, and people learned to become more civil in their ways of settling disputes. Ranchers and livestock owners could often subdivide blocks of lands and then distribute the property as fairly and equally as they could. Townships without the protection of official law enforcement also had to stave off any criminal elements as best they could. This could involve organizing posses, which were groups of citizens who came together to either hunt down or protect their town from outlaws. And the West became even wilder with the discovery of gold in California in 1848. The gold rush attracted over 300,000 people from across the world in search of their fortune. Naturally, this sudden and huge influx of wide diversity of people meant that disputes were frequent, and the law was often hard to uphold. The majority of miners were men, and most were without families or loved ones, meaning that the main source of recreation was in many saloons that scattered the goldfields. Combinations of alcohol, frustrations, jealousies, and the lack of official law enforcement indeed resulted in violence. However, for the large part, order still prevailed. People quickly realized that for things to run smoothly, a general consensus on claiming rights had to be agreed upon. A miner's code was put into practice, and for the most part, it worked pretty well. Anyone could claim a piece of land on which to mine. Even if they didn't own the land, they claimed the land by notifying everyone around them, and anything that they found was theirs to keep. Once they'd moved on from their stake, it was up for grabs. The general cohesion with which people worked on the goldfield subsequently goes against the image of out-and-out lawlessness in the Old West. Still, as settlements began to pop up everywhere, the government was keen to establish law and formal institutions in California. It officially became a state in 1850. The booming population and concerns over crime resulted in the San Francisco Committee of Vigilance in 1851. There was a large group of several hundred citizens who had held their own court and dished out occasionally harsh justice to any wrongdoers. These committees were prevalent throughout the Wild West until formal federal and state law agencies presided. The American West was probably at its wildest at the conclusion of the American Civil War in 1865. Some settled down, others didn't. The war left droves of battle-hardened and often disillusioned men in search of whatever they felt they were owed. The later part of the 19th century is when many of the legendary Wild West shootouts actually took place. Wyatt Earp and his brothers at the OK Corral in 1881, Wild Bill Hickok drawing his gun too fast for Davis Tutt in 1865. Yeah, these encounters did happen, and they've been immortalized in American popular culture. However, so did the relatively peaceful building of settlements and communities that were made possible by settlers coming together in order to realize their common goals. So, how wild was life in the Wild West? Nowhere near as wild as Hollywood would have you believe. Although it certainly had its moments. Not that it was a piece of cake. Well, the answer, it's most likely somewhere in between.